Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rachel Wesson, and I am the Events and Communications Specialist at the Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. It is my pleasure to welcome each of you to our discussion today, Future-Proofing for a Changing Privacy and Security Landscape, featuring Steve Weber of CLTC and Kate Charlet of Google. So it is my pleasure to introduce our facilitator for today's discussion, Professor Steve Weber. Steve Weber is a professor at UC Berkeley, both at the School of Information and the Department of Political Science. He is also our founding and still current faculty director at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. It was recently announced that Steve plans to retire at the end of 2021 after more than 30 years at UC Berkeley. So to his chagrin, I'm going to continue to acknowledge all of his incredible contributions to Berkeley, to CLTC, to the field writ large, and wish him all the best as he enters this next chapter in 2022. So glad we still have him for today. And with that, Steve, congratulations, thank you, and I will pass things over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. I still haven't gotten used to the R word, so I won't comment on that, but want to also add my thanks to everybody for coming today, and particularly to Kate. Just before we get started, just a couple of quick notes. We like to double down before we have conversations like this at CLTC on our ethics disclosure, simply because the areas that we work in involve very live, prominent, contemporary policy issues and often large companies. So we go beyond, of course, we comply with, but we go beyond the standard UC Berkeley protections, rules, and norms that govern research funding and funding of centers like ours. So for anyone who would like to read more or know more about that, on our website, there's a very clear and simple statement of how we think about ethics and practice ethics in our funders. It lists all the funders of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity back from the very beginning. Just to kind of acknowledge that, or explicitly acknowledge that over the years, we have received unrestricted research gifts, both from Google and from other companies that might come up on our conversation today. And unrestricted research gifts, as you know, come with no strings attached. So again, for more information on that, you can look at our policy page. And if anyone has any questions, please do reach out to us. It's something we take very, very seriously. With that off the table, I want to introduce you to Kate Charlet and tell you a little bit about her and talk just very briefly about the issues we're going to talk about today. Kate, thank you again for joining us, taking time out of a busy day on Zoom meetings to be in a Zoom meeting. Kate now works at Google's Center of Excellence as the Director for Data Governance. I'm sure she'll tell us all about what she does there. She works on issues related to privacy, information security, government access. I met Kate, I guess it's probably about 4 years ago now, when she was the inaugural director setting up the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. Even before that, before she went to Carnegie, she served a decade as a civil servant in the US government, spending some time as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, at least in an acting capacity for cyber policy, and as Director for Strategic Planning at the National Security Council in the White House, or in the East Executive Office building, depending on which building you were in, Kate. Kate, do you want to start us off and just tell us a little bit about what your role is at Google, the kinds of issues that you're working on these days, what drew you to move from government and the think tank world into the private sector? And then we'll get into some specific questions about the issues that we think are of interest to the CLTC community and the people on the call today.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Steve and team, and I'll add my congratulations to your retirement. That's really great and exciting news that you're going into a new chapter. And I was really thrilled to get the invite to come talk to everybody that's here and catch up with you, Steve, from our chance to work back when I was at the Carnegie Endowment. So as you mentioned, I'm in government affairs and public policy in Google. What that means is we are engaging with civil society, with academia, policymakers, industry colleagues, regulators, and more on issues of public policy and regulatory interest. And we also have an internal function advising internally to the company on those kinds of matters and issues as they're thinking about decisions for the business and for their products. So we've got a very wide range of products at Google, obviously, that all have very different kind of ways in which they operate. So it can be broad and complicated and fun. I am the director for data governance in what we call our centers of excellence, which more or less means we're the global subject matter experts for the government affairs team on our issue areas. And for me, that's privacy, it's law enforcement access to data issues, and government surveillance issues, and it's also cybersecurity. So anytime you think of an issue that cuts across regions, that cuts across our product areas, that's where we will get involved. So on things like data flows, biometrics, kids, data protection regulation globally, that's where the Centers of Excellence comes in. You asked a little bit about how I came to Google and how I got here, and so maybe I will, given the audience that we've got students here, I'll indulge, if you'll indulge me a little bit in going a bit further back. I was a senior in college in 2001, I'll date myself, in studying molecular biology. And actually, I was visiting Berkeley that year to apply to the PhD program in genetics. And that was the year the 9/11 attacks happened. And quickly after that, the anthrax attacks. And watching the response to the anthrax attacks in particular made me realize I could do something else with my molecular biology degree that, other than go to medical school or do what I had been planning to do, which was research. And so I kind of made a leap and moved down to DC and got an internship that really opened my eyes to international relations and public service. And I think that's where I kind of began to work in technology and security for the better part of the next 20 years. And I really enjoyed working cyber issues in DoD. I mean, you couldn't walk 5 feet without tripping over a huge policy issues. I loved working on global stability issues at Carnegie. And I ended up coming to Google because the issues that I would be working on, surveillance, cybersecurity, privacy, I mean, they're so important to our society. The parameters around which companies and governments do data protection and data governance are incredibly impactful, especially for a company like Google. Just even the same, like we in cybersecurity, for example, the work that we do is like we scan 100 billion installed apps for malware. We block 15 billion spam messages every day. And so that's the kind of thing, the kind of impact that really connected me back to what I had been doing at DoD and gives a real mission kind of orientation to the work. So, yeah.
So interesting, Kate. I did not know about your background in molecular biology. I will tell you, it's not too late to pursue that PhD at Berkeley, should you still be interested. But that aside, it's an incredibly broad remit, and I hope we'll hit on a bunch of the different things you're working on today. But let's start with something that's just really simple and concrete, and that has really almost nothing to do with Google, frankly. When you're working on the West Coast, even remotely or even virtually, you feel like you're at some distance from the granular conversations in DC in terms of what's up, what's down. And so the specific thing we would love to hear your thoughts on, because every year we seem to go through this cycle. This is the year we're going to have a federal privacy law. I feel like I hear that every January, February, and then March, April comes and not so much. So we're about to enter another cycle of, maybe it's like a shortened version of the hype cycle or something like this. what's your view? I mean, a lot has changed in this year, from the Wall Street Journal, Facebook files to, I mean, make your list. What's on the horizon for federal privacy legislation? Is something coming in 2022? And if it is, what's it likely to look like? And if not, why not? And what should we be looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think new regulations in this space are a matter of when and where, not if. I do firmly believe, like, whatever year it is, like, it is going to happen. And you're right that the conversation has evolved. There's a lot of new facets to it, even just this year, and there's new urgency to it. There's definitely not a shortage of activity in the US. And by the way, I would welcome a federal law. Google supports a federal law. We think that sentiment is shared very widely in the privacy sector, in the private sector. I think in terms of what's coming for federal legislation, it's clear to me that Congress has a real interest in legislating. That is, you see that in the recent hearings. There are still political hurdles. Of course, the ones that we hear about the most are private right of action and preemption. They get a lot of attention, but I don't think we should be spending only thinking about those issues when we think about federal legislation, because there are a lot of other fundamental questions that need to be thought through when it comes to federal legislation. The substantive provisions of a bill and how it's drafted matter a great deal. The good news on that is we've seen a lot of new state bills. There's been a lot of conversation around this, and I think there's a lot of alignment in terms of the legislation across the privacy community about some of those core parts of a privacy bill. Things like access and deletion or data minimization, individual control. I think there's a lot to learn from GDPR and capture from GDPR and lessons to learn as well. And one of the things that I think will be different this year will be companies will move into the compliance phase of CPRA, the California law. The Virginia and Colorado laws will take effect in 2023. So you will see companies start to prepare for compliance with those in 2022. And I think it's important to kind of recognize that those aren't just copy and paste bills. They're different bills. They have different definitions. They have different obligations. And so I'll be interested to watch out in 2022 as companies start to get real about pursuing compliance. We'll hear more about the impact of those bills and the impact of the differences, not just the bills, but the differences between the bills. And I think that could feed into and affect the federal conversation. And not to draw this out, because you should ask a lot of other questions. Happy to kind of go in any direction you want. But the other big thing that I think folks will be watching is the FTC here. The FTC has indicated that it will consider using its Magnuson-Moss rulemaking authority to issue privacy rules. And that's all just developing, but I think we'll have a lot of people watching and could contribute also to, a sense in Congress about, momentum. Hopefully that could unlock some process and progress in Congress as well. I'll pause there.
Really interesting, Sim. Yeah, 2022 could be a very, very interesting year in that regard. So let's skip forward a little bit and talk about a little bit of a longer term future. And so when I think of kind of the corporate culture of Google, it's no secret that Google seems committed to two things, from the outside at least: data-driven decision-making, which I'm a huge fan, and long-term research and development perspectives, of which I'm also a huge fan. And so thinking about how they relate to each other is something that, we've tried at CLTC over the years to constantly kind of look just a little bit over the horizon. And we use this term in the title of this seminar, FutureProofing. You're focused on things that have a great deal of immediate urgency to them, like all the issues that we just talked about privacy legislation in 2022. At the same point, presumably, when you're kind of not in the urgent mode, you're thinking about those longer term issues of data governance. And I'm just curious how you kind of think about future-proofing that work for the next, 3 years or 5 years, where, for example, and maybe we can talk about this in the context of the really interesting and very, very relevant issues around data flows, whether that be cross-national or even cross-state, given what you've just addressed. So, yeah, that's a long question. So I'll just stop and put a question mark after what I just said.
Yeah, that's good, and there's a lot to unpack there too. And also, by the way, I think the area that I see as really critical to future-proofing is an area that academia and academic organizations have a lot to offer and a lot to collaborate on too. And I don't think it's not an easy question to answer, certainly. How to future-proof, what's the biggest privacy and data protection challenge or imperative? I think of, I often think about that over the next 3 to 5 years. To me, it's how do you unlock the value of information and insights in a privacy preserving way to be useful and actionable for society? And I know that's a mouthful, but I spent probably 6 months into my time at Google. The pandemic hit, and as we were thinking about how to contribute to that, we developed a number of products, which happy to kind of talk about if anybody has Q&A later. The community mobility reports as an example of that provided aggregate insights into people's mobility patterns during the COVID pandemic, but used privacy preserving technology to make sure that was protected. And so, I think technology is often portrayed as a threat to privacy, but actually technology can help stakeholders everywhere, like in any sector, gain access to insights based on sensitive data, when if you were to share the raw data directly, that would be problematic. So I do think we're kind of in a phase, in a moment where privacy by design and privacy preserving technology are critical, where a lot of new technologies are expanding both kind of in scale and scope and speed, but that we haven't yet fully realized the potential of that. I think there's a lot that governments and regulators could do, we could all do, to invest in understanding these technologies, incentivizing their use, and moving to a world where it's easier to unlock the power of information and still really get the value and the use cases out of it. I guess switching a little bit to your data flows question and future proofing. Again, we can talk about Schrems 2 as well, and kind of the challenges with the invalidation of enhanced privacy shield. I think one of the big takeaways from that is the need for stable, kind of durable frameworks that are global in nature around understanding of government access to data, understanding of frameworks around data flows that allow greater kind of interoperability and stability for data flows over the long run. There's lots of different examples of this. The cross-border privacy, APEC cross-border privacy rules are an example, and I think there's a lot more to be done there.
It's super interesting, Kate. I wanted to come back later to privacy preserving technologies in particular and how you folks are thinking about specific examples. Like, just occurred to me as we were talking about that it has a branding problem because you want to acronym it as PPT and it looks like PowerPoint. So I'm never going to actually do that. Just going to call it privacy preserving technologies. But let's talk about, like, without dragging ourselves too much into the weeds of, the moment to moment business model challenges. One of the big issues that continues to plague, or I'll just say plague, the overall industry is the reliance on advertising supported business models. And it's controversial and at the same point, essential and central. So last month, this is in November, October, we saw really the first concrete and public financial open feedback about the economic consequences of the third-party advertising issues as they changed around Apple's iOS 14 approach. Before that, it was all theoretical. We didn't know how it was really going to be treated, how consumers were going to respond to those little pop-up boxes. Now we have at least 1 quarter's worth of evidence. Some companies were hurt very badly by that, like Snap. Other companies were hurt less badly or even advantaged by it. And just want to kind of get your sense, without giving away anything proprietary with regard to Google's interests, how you folks see that landscape. One could almost argue that this is the first significant mass privacy protecting technology. I think Apple would make that argument. You guys might not. I think other companies might not. But how is that playing out for Google, and how do you think about that issue more generally?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's reflective of a broader set of ecosystem changes that are underway, and we can talk a little bit more about that with some of the ads ecosystem kind of changes that we've been thinking about. I think our focus around all of that has been to support developers, businesses, advertisers, creators, publishers, the whole ecosystem through the changes that are happening today. It is clear, we want to work with industry. We want to do that in an open and a multi-stakeholder way to make the web private by default, right? And that's why we're experimenting with some new approaches to privacy on the web. We call that privacy sandbox. It's why we're working to prevent invasive covert tracking, which can be the result of overly blunt approaches. And at the same time, doing that in a way that allows sites the ability to provide useful ads and fund their businesses. The open web is founded and integral in many ways in the ability to provide content to folks and to fund that and make it available for everybody through ads. And that's something worth continuing to have the discussion about how to provide that functionality, how to support the open web, but to do it in a privacy preserving way. And that's not going to be easy. That's a hard thing to do. But it's all the more reason to do it.
So let's talk about one concrete example of that, which from outside the company was extraordinarily interesting. Maybe it was last year. I don't remember exactly the timing on this one. Google ran these interesting experiments with federated learning on cohorts. Maybe you can describe for our audience. Not everybody might know exactly what that is or remember how it worked. And I remember reading about it and the technical background and thinking, this is a really interesting experiment. This is exactly the sort of thing that we should be experimenting with. But the marketplace didn't like it. The public didn't like it. Can you talk a little bit about how that experiment works, what it is that you folks were trying to do, and your sense of why there was such a negative reaction to it? Just me personally, I was stunned by the negative reaction. And I don't understand it, and I really want to.
Yeah. So FLoC, or Federated Learning of Cohorts, it's one of several proposals for technologies that we have put out to replace third-party cookies in the future. And yeah, as you noted, we received substantial feedback from the web community on federated learning cohorts. And right now, just where we are in that, and I will answer the question and explain what it is. We're incorporating that input before we go to further ecosystem testing on it. I do want to back up for a minute and explain maybe why people are hearing about Flock in the first place, which is, it goes back a few years now, but in 2019, we saw that user expectations were changing around third-party cookies. They weren't meeting those expectations, right? If you look at the research and some of the polls, Pew Research, for example, said that 72% of people feel like almost everything they do is being tracked online by advertisers, technology firms, companies, and something like 80+% of them say they felt the potential risks they face because of that data collection outweigh the benefits. So, to end cross-site tracking, the web needs to move away from third-party cookies. And by the way, I think I mentioned this before, other tracking techniques like browser fingerprinting. The challenge is that over the last 30 years, many of the core functionalities of the web have grown to depend, and rely on those same techniques. And we don't want the web to lose the critical capabilities. Things like enabling publishers to keep growing their businesses. There's fraud and abuse fighting and kind of spam fighting technologies as well that are core to that. So Privacy Sandbox is Google-led, but it's industry-wide effort to replace legacy mechanisms like third-party cookies with safer solutions that protect privacy. So that's where Flock comes in as one of the functionalities that we're trying to have a conversation with industry to figure out how to replace that functionality with something that's more privacy preserving. So Flock is a technology where the browser uses on-device computation. So the browser history never leaves a person's browser or device to place you in a large group numbering in the thousands. And so unlike today's technology, individuals can't be identified, but members would likely be interested in the same kind of content or ads. So you can maintain the same sort of functionality without ever requiring individual personal information. So the web community raised a lot of questions about this, and we learned a few things from those engagements. I think some of the concerns that were raised and that we had conversations on and kind of taking the feedback to incorporate is, how do you make sure you don't replicate issues with third-party cookies just in a new way? So Flock shouldn't make it easy to collect and use sensitive data. It shouldn't be able to target vulnerable groups, not just individuals, but vulnerable groups. You shouldn't be able to join Flock data with existing user profiles. And so we're taking a lot of those inputs on board to further incorporate into the design. At a more meta level, I think it showed us that there's a lot of interest from civil society and regulators and industry in getting the next version of ad targeting right, and that's like that yeah. We agree that's a good thing. There should be a lot of interest in that because there's a lot of livelihoods and access to content and the model of the open web that are impacted by that. And then I guess the other kind of meta lesson there is balancing privacy and utility is difficult. It's hard. It is possible, it's possible to do, and have both of those things, right? We have to find ways to have the utility and have the privacy preserving nature of that. But we can do it. But that's why we're taking an approach that involves a lot of engagement and kind of stakeholder. We're not the only ones proposing kind of privacy sandbox proposals. We're really welcoming and inviting of others to contribute those ideas too.
It's great. Yeah, I want to come back to this, Kate, before we end, to talk a little bit about the sort of the one can legislate a regulatory sandbox. One can create a legal sandbox. It's hard to create a public opinion sandbox, but we sort of need one, actually, because the kinds of things you're talking about require experimentation. That's a little bit of a editorial comment, I guess. Second editorial comment is, I guess we're going to all have to change our language, because we can no longer refer to things as meta level without being confused for something else. So we'll have to take the word meta out of our adjective box. I want to remind everybody, please submit questions through the question and answer section, because we're going to turn to that in just a minute or two. But Kate, before we talk around audience questions, let me just take you back to your roots for a moment and see if you have any reflections you want to share with us. You spent a lot of your career working on technology and national security issues. That's a very, very live conversation these days. So I'd like to know what's the most important questions on your mind these days that need to be addressed in that very broad space? Anyone like myself who thinks about trans-Pacific relations and what we're setting ourselves up for with China, tech decoupling, tech cold war, these things that have a way of becoming, in some respects, a self-fulfilling prophecy, or perhaps maybe we're not moving boldly enough or fast enough in that space. And I know you're interested in the supply chain issues that are embedded in and sometimes drive that conversation. So any thoughts about where the attention of folks like us ought to be focused on as we think about the technology national security nexus?
Yeah, and to be honest, in some aspects of this issue, like Chinese data governance law, China came out with a law recently. Yeah. I haven't had to deep dive too much into that. Many of our core products like search and Gmail aren't available in China. So processing personal information in China is relatively limited for us compared to other multinational tech companies. I think the question you're asking, those are all good, very good questions that clearly everybody is actively grappling with, including us. I do think it actually tracks back nicely to the question of federal privacy legislation and why that is important for American global influence, which I do think that's one of several really good arguments for moving ahead with federal privacy legislation. We are already a leader in technology and data services, and I think we should be a leader in data protection too. Not least because the flow of data contributes more now to GDP than the flow of goods. And if you have a federal privacy legislation in place that can promote data flows, it can promote compatibility with rules in other countries that are both pro-privacy and pro-innovation. So, I think we will continue to support the US government, EU, other like-minded countries in preserving democratic values and digital economies. We will, continue protecting fundamental rights like freedom of speech and expression. We think there's a role for industry to play in that on focusing less on kind of borders and more on making sure that the products people use every day, the information people need every day is available globally.
I'm going to sort of flip back and forth now between some of the audience questions and some other things that I just want to probe you on, Kate. And so answer the ones that you want in the way in which you want. And I know you're practiced at that. But so there's a very interesting question that came in that I'm going to just reframe in a slightly more provocative way. So if we were to take the recent Chinese legislation on privacy, data flows, data protection at its word, and build an internet that was optimized for those rules on the presumption that, let's just assume that they will be fully implemented in the way in which they're written. Well, I guess you probably haven't read all that legislation, so maybe this isn't a fair question to ask. But do you know, is there, and maybe you couldn't answer this question even if you knew, is there a conversation taking place either in a company like yours or other firms that have exited the China market now or in the future as to, are these laws enough for us to engage in a conversation about re-entering the China market? Or is there a scenario under which some future set of laws that the Chinese government could pass would make us interested in that conversation? Because at the end of the day, if we're talking about for-profit businesses in the China market, you'd probably want a ethically responsible, legally manageable, and business sensible way to engage with 1.8 billion people on the planet.
Yeah, I mean, so let's see. Again, yeah, to your point, I haven't kind of gone deep into the China law, so I'd have to defer to others to kind of talk through the details of how that, how that would look globally or how to interoperate with that. I think, not the meta point, since we can't say that anymore. I think what I would say on that though is what we want interoperability of data protection laws. We want interoperability of data flows. That is what is going to bring an integrated global economy that has data flows with trust, right? I think we can have strong privacy protections and we can have open data flows. We can have both of those things with the right frameworks in place. So I don't know if this is a great answer to your question, but I think what it, like at the root of it, to me, it's about interoperability. It's about global frameworks. It's about bringing countries together, whether that's at the OECD, which has been an effective and important forum to have conversations about, among like-minded about data flows, and we've got to continue having those conversations.
Let me go up one level of abstraction now, and then maybe we'll come back down to something more concrete afterwards. But this is a question that comes from somewhere between my brain and my heart, because I feel it very intensely. Yeah, so I lived through, with a lot of fun and excitement, the early days of the World Wide Web in the 1990s, and the digital idealists who believed that the web or internet technology generally was going to sort of overwhelm a set of human problems, not even solve them, but literally overwhelm them. And I always refer students to, kind of go back, or anyone younger really, to go back and read something like John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence in Cyberspace, I think it was 1996, to just kind of capture the zeitgeist of an era where technology was truly trusted more than almost any other institution in human society. Now, rocket forward to 2021, and it's almost like the script has flipped, right? I think there's a large proportion of the American population, and you just referred to it in your numbers about people's fear about privacy on the web, who sort of come to the conversation about technology now with a very, very skeptical eye. And not only do they not really trust the companies or the technology per se, but they're no longer convinced that the world is a better place for having this kind of digital information technology so embedded in our lives. Now, people take very different views on how to solve that problem. You've lived through this as well, and now you're in the middle of it from the corporate perspective. How do you folks think about this issue of user trust? Google is obviously at a much higher level of express trust than some other technology companies, but surely you felt some of that general downdraft as well. How do you folks think? How do you personally think about that?
Yeah. Trust is foundational. It's essential for a company like ours, for other companies, for the technologies that we're putting forward. An example of this that is high on my mind was the exposure notification work that Google and Apple collaborated on last year to enable exposure notifications of folks who were in proximity to one another, and somebody later tests positive for COVID. Mm-hmm. And there are different ways to enable that. There was a very robust debate internationally in the United States among academics about the best way to do that. And at its heart, to get people to use a technology that's going to have value to something like the COVID-19 response, they have to trust it.
Yeah.
And that technology, if you don't have that trust, you don't have the uptake, you don't have, it doesn't work. So I think that's one example of which there are, almost anything, like literally any product that we might talk about. I think you could find a story like that. And so I think expectations are rising from consumers, mm-hmm. from regulators, from everyone. And that's right. That's rightly so. And it's Google's job, it's companies' jobs to rise to that challenge, to rise to the challenge of giving, better product experiences, better security, better privacy protections, for making that easy for people to fit into their lives without 100, toggles or like a master's degree in privacy. But again, like it's increasingly clear that this can't just be a choice for businesses and organizations. We need a law, right, with clear mm-hmm. individual rights and controls, clear expectations for businesses, strong accountability and enforcement mechanisms. And so that's one of the reasons, law helps too, right? We're talking about trust. Let's not just make some of that, let's enshrine it in regulation too. So that's why I think one of the reasons we're supportive of federal privacy law.
Interesting. Okay. Let me take you back, sort of penultimate question, to something you talked about at the very, very beginning, and your work in law enforcement access to data, or exceptional access, or whatever you want to call it. And again, two almost like perennial issues that come up that many of us have worked on and touched in different ways. And it'd be really great to hear your perspective on where you think these two law enforcement access issues might be headed, because there's been some interesting changes in at least one of them, even in the last couple of days. So that you probably know the two I'm going to ask. One is the never-ending, except sometimes it goes into hibernation for a little period of time, encryption question. And the second is facial recognition, which around which there have been some surprises the last couple of days, at least was surprising to me the last couple of days.
Yeah, so great questions. And I think at the level of government surveillance, right? I also think, again, interoperability and thinking through the frameworks through which we have a common understanding of what are the expectations of governments in terms of access to data, in terms of the announcements, in terms of their use of technology. I think facial recognition is a really interesting one. We've grappled with this a lot as well. For example, we made a decision not to offer a open purpose API on facial recognition pretty early on. I've seen the kind of announcements that have been made since then as well. And I think when there's a technology like this that has so much potential, and yet also it can evolve and it will evolve in many unforeseen ways. That's an argument for a robust conversation around this and a multi-stakeholder conversation around this. So, where exactly it goes, I think it's clear that we need to grapple with where we think the technology is going to go. What are the right kinds of guardrails to put around that, and have that conversation both from a government and an industry perspective together. On encryption, we've seen the debate kind of change and evolve, go in spikes, oftentimes spikes, including legislation around addressing concerns about the impact of encryption on law enforcement access to data. Again, and when I was at Carnegie, we worked on an encryption policy working group to bring people to the table to try to find a tractable way forward on that conversation. Encryption is so critical to the security of the web, of communications, it's one of the most important things that the administration mentioned in the cybersecurity EO in terms of encrypting data. And so I think we're going to just continue to see it be a really challenging problem that we've all got to keep working on together.
Yeah, I hope, just another editorial comment, I hope we can be working on it in less urgent circumstances, that when it kind of like disappears from the headlines is when we actually should be talking about it more intently. And so let me take one more penultimate question quickly, Kate, and then finish up and turn it back over to Rachel. So the last penultimate question, almost last question, it would just be really interesting. It's not uncommon these days for people to move from the government world to the think tank world to industry, back and forth in different directions. You've done it. And sometimes folks in our world outside of those sectors in the academic world like to imagine that there are very discrete and clear conflicts of interest between those, let's call them domains. And then others that I've spoken to who have made the move a number of times sometimes take the position that actually it isn't really conflict of interest. There's some more like different cultures of problem solving. And the interests aren't quite so at odds with each other as the cultures of problem solving are. It'd just be super interesting to hear your reflections on whether or not, where you are in that question. It's a big, broad one, so forgive me.
Yeah, it's a broad question. I don't think that there is a single answer to that, right? That interests align or don't align. I don't think about it that way. I think there are plenty of examples I could cite where interests do align, and I think in cybersecurity, that's a very clear example in the wake of the cybersecurity executive order. And, our CEO joined President Biden at a CEO forum on cybersecurity. We've contributed into a collective conversation around supply chain security, around best practices for cyber hygiene, around strategies for zero trust within government. And so I think, at its best, which is what I think a lot of the time is we've all just got different capabilities and different lenses and insights and experience that we can contribute to a conversation around, moving things forward. Even on, federal privacy legislation, again, we all want federal privacy legislation, And so I think that there are more areas than your question would kind of as to what where we have alignment.
So Kate, your headphones just told us that we're almost done. And the clock says the same thing. But one last quick question, I'm gonna turn it back to Rachel. It's a question we always ask our friends and colleagues outside the academic world, and it's this. In your job and on the issues that really concern you the most, there's a bunch of academics out here who have a little bit, sometimes a little more time, maybe a little bit more kind of like domain freedom to figure out what it is they should be working on. What would you have us do? What is the one biggest problem that you feel like, boy, I wish somebody in the academic world would solve this problem for me?
Work on enhancing the state of the art on privacy preserving technology. Federated learning enables machine learning without removing underlying data from a device. Differential privacy, mathematical technique to enable us to obtain aggregate insights from data. Secure multi-party computing, cryptographic technology to help you connect encrypted data sets and share and combine the results. But there's so much more work that can be done on advancing the state of these technologies. So that's maybe for a more kind of academically focused set of stakeholders. I think from from a policy set of stakeholders, there are key questions that still are out there on data flows, on children's protection, on biometrics and facial recognition. And I think the more insight and research in those areas, the better off we're going to be in having that conversation.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kate, for that one most important thing that you told us to work on. But a number of colleagues in the computer science department are going to feel very much cheered by what you said about PPT technologies. Let me just thank you, turn it back over to Rachel. It's been extraordinarily valuable and interesting and fun. I know it's not easy to take an extra hour out of your day and spend it on Zoom, but we're really, really grateful for you making the time for us today.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be here. Good to chat with
Rachel, back to you.
All right, thank you so much. And yes, just another big thank you to you, Kate, for taking the time out today. And thanks, Steve, for moderating. So as we wind things down, just want to give a big thanks to the various CLTC supporters, our community and foundation supporters, as well as our industry partners who help make events like this possible. Also want to share just a few ways that you can get in touch with CLTC and with Kate directly. So please follow us on Twitter or head to the CLTC website where you can sign up for our newsletter so that you aren't missing any announcements or future events such as this one. And if you'd like to reach out to Kate, she has kindly provided some information where you can contact her. So I will leave this slide up for just a minute or two in case folks want to jot down any information. But again, a big thank you to Kate and Steve, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today and for asking some very thoughtful questions. I hope you stay tuned for more events and announcements from CLTC. If we don't see you again this year, wishing you all a safe and happy holiday season and look forward to seeing you all in the new year. All right, take care.